The quiet neighbor. The gloves hit the grass at Nathan Cole's feet before anyone understood what was happening.
Tyler Vance stood over them, young and certain, telling the whole neighborhood he was going to put the quiet widower down right here, prove once and for all who the strong one was.
40 faces turned toward Nathan. He didn't move.
To all of them, he looked like a man swallowing his fear.
None of them knew that every breath, every glance, every still second belonged to a man who had once commanded a Navy SEAL team. So why did he refuse to fight?
Willow Creek was the kind of neighborhood where people learned each other's lawns before they learned each other's names. Nathan Cole had lived on the quiet end of it for a few years, in a house he kept plain and orderly, the way a man keeps a thing when he no longer expects anyone but himself to see it. He was somewhere in his 40s, broad through the shoulders in a manner he made no show of, and he moved through his days with the unhurried economy of someone who had learned long ago that most problems solve themselves if you refuse to feed them. His wife had passed a few years before he came to the street, and the grief had settled into him slowly and without drama, changing the shape of him where no one could see.
He didn't talk about her. He didn't talk about much.
The neighbors decided he was polite and distant and left it there, which suited him fine. He mowed his own grass, took his coffee on the porch before the sun was fully up, and kept his blinds half drawn against a world he'd already seen too much of. What none of them knew was the work he did, or what that work had once been. On paper, he was a security assessment specialist, a contractor the government brought in to evaluate companies that wanted its defense money. He read files, walked facilities, and wrote reports that decided whether a business was trustworthy enough to be handed something that mattered. It was careful, invisible work, and he was good at it because he'd spent an earlier life on the other side of every risk those reports were meant to measure. He had commanded a Navy SEAL team once. There were missions with his name buried in them that would stay classified long after he was gone. Nights he'd walked back from that most men never walk back from at all. He'd left that world on purpose and told no one on Willow Creek a word of it, because the whole point of the quiet house and the half-drawn blinds was to be a man who no longer needed anyone to know what he could do. The Vance family bought the property next door in the early part of spring, and they arrived the way money arrives when it wants to be noticed, all at once and loudly. Charles Vance was a tall, well-fed man who ran a transport company large enough to matter in the region, the kind of operation that moved freight up and down the coast and had recently set its sights on something bigger. He carried himself like a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around him, and he shook hands with the whole street inside a week, remembering each name just long enough to seem warm. His son came with him. Tyler Vance was young, a few years past 20, built hard and proud of it. He fought professionally, or wanted the world to believe he did, working the smaller mixed martial arts circuits and carrying himself as though every man he met were a lesser draft of himself. He talked about his record before anyone asked. He walked the neighborhood shirtless in the mornings, watching for his own reflection in car windows, and he wore his confidence the way some young men wear armor.
Against a fear they haven't yet learned to name.
It didn't take Tyler long to notice the quiet man next door, and something about Nathan's stillness seemed to insult him. Here was a neighbor who didn't measure him, didn't flinch, didn't offer the small deference Tyler had grown used to collecting. To a young man who understood the world only as a contest, a man who refused to compete looked like a man who was afraid to. Tyler decided, without quite deciding, that he was going to find out what Nathan Cole was made of. The first time was small. Nathan came out one morning to find his trash cans knocked into the street and dragged half a block, the lids gone, the contents scattered across 2 lawns. He gathered it all without a word, and when Tyler watched him from his own driveway with a lazy grin, Nathan only nodded once, the way you nod at weather. The lack of reaction seemed to land wrong on Tyler, who had wanted heat and gotten nothing, and he went back inside looking cheated.
It escalated the way these things do.
A row of young plantings along Nathan's walk was trampled flat within the week, the soil churned up as if by boots that had taken their time.
Tyler started making remarks when neighbors were within earshot, loud enough to carry.
Calling Nathan the ghost of the block, the old man who hid in his house, laughing at his own jokes with 2 or 3 younger men who'd begun trailing after him.
Nathan answered none of it. He replanted what he could and let the rest go.
There was a hunger in the way Tyler watched him now, an appetite that had grown past mischief. He wanted the fight itself, not just the flinch, and he started arranging the run-ins on purpose.
stepping into Nathan's path on the sidewalk, standing too close, letting his shoulder catch Nathan's as he passed, then turning as if hoping to be swung on. Each time, Nathan simply moved around him and kept walking, his face empty of everything but a faint, distant patience. And each time, Tyler read that patience as proof the man had nothing under it. He could not have been more wrong. That was the strange arithmetic of it. Everything Nathan did in those encounters was a choice made by a man who knew exactly how the alternative would end. He tracked the boy's weight and stance out of an old habit he couldn't switch off, catalogued the openings without wanting to, and understood in the first 10 seconds of the first shoulder check that Tyler had never once fought anyone who actually intended to hurt him. Restraint, for Nathan, wasn't the absence of ability. It was the whole of it. Charles saw the friction between his son and the neighbor and, for a while, treated it as nothing worth his attention, a young man's noise. He had bigger things on his mind. His company had put in for a defense logistics contract that spring, a multi-year agreement to move sensitive government freight, with a sum attached that ran into the tens of millions of dollars. It was the kind of deal that would carry the Vance name into a different league entirely, and Charles had spent months and no small amount of money positioning himself to win it. The two men had spoken only in passing until one evening in late spring, when the street held one of its early gatherings and Charles found himself beside Nathan near the edge of a neighbor's yard, both of them nursing drinks they didn't much want. Charles talked, as he always did, and the talk drifted toward business, toward the contract he was chasing in the maze of federal review a company had to pass through before the money came. He complained about the process with the easy contempt of a man who assumed everyone shared it, the endless assessments, the faceless evaluators sitting somewhere deciding your future off a stack of paper. Nathan listened, and somewhere in the middle of it, a cold recognition moved through him. Charles named the contract, and the name landed exactly where it shouldn't have. It was one of the files sitting open on Nathan's own desk. Vance Transport wasn't just his loud new neighbor, it was a business he'd been assigned to evaluate, and the man beside him complaining about faceless evaluators was complaining about him. He kept his expression level and let Charles talk himself out, offering nothing beyond the small sounds a man makes to seem agreeable. He didn't say what he did for a living, or that he knew the contract by its file number. The whole time he said it, Charles watched Nathan's face for the crack he was so certain would finally show itself. It didn't show, but it cost him more than anything before it had. Something moved behind Nathan's eyes and was set down again, the way a man sets down a heavy thing he's already decided not to throw. For one held second the entire shape of him seemed to change, and then went still again. He looked at Tyler, no, at Charles, for a long moment with an expression the man didn't have the experience to read, then turned and walked back inside, and the door shut behind him with a quiet that landed worse on the street than any slammed door would have. The neighbors who saw it didn't know what to make of him. Some had begun to whisper that the man next door was a coward, that all his stillness was just fear wearing a calm face, and Tyler fed that whisper every chance he got. Others were less sure, though they couldn't have said why, only that something in the way the quiet man absorbed all of it didn't sit right with the word they kept reaching for. Either way, Nathan gave them nothing to settle the question, and the not knowing spread through Willow Creek like a low fog. Charles watched all of it from his own property with a patience his son didn't have in him. He began quietly keeping the footage, his own clips, and whatever the neighbors filmed. Saving every frame in which Nathan might be made to look like something other than a man swallowing abuse in the street. He had no interest in the truth of any of it. He cared only about the seconds that could be cut loose from that truth and shown by themselves, and he gathered them the way a man gathers dry kindling in summer, knowing exactly where he meant to light the fire. The neighborhood barbecue fell on a warm Saturday near the end of spring. The kind of gathering Willow Creek held twice a year, folding tables set out across the cul-de-sac, smoke rising off two grills, most of the street standing around in the easy noise of it. Charles had made a point of hosting the larger share of the thing, moving through the crowd shaking hands and refilling cups, the generous neighbor steering the whole afternoon without ever appearing to touch it. Among the guests was an older man, silver-haired and straight-backed, visiting the family across the street for the weekend, introduced to the group only as a retired Navy officer. Few of them caught his name in the noise. Nathan hadn't wanted to come at all. He came anyway, because a man who hides from a block party hands that block something to talk about, and he'd learned over the last weeks that his absence could be used against him as easily as his presence. He stood near the edge of the gathering with a plate he wasn't eating from, watching the crowd the way he watched everything, mapping exits and distances by a reflex he'd never been able to switch off. He felt the whole afternoon tilt the moment Tyler started toward him across the grass with something balled up in his fist and that familiar hungry certainty already lighting his face. The gloves hit the grass at Nathan's feet, and the noise of the party fell away in a widening circle around the two of them. Tyler stood over the gloves, young and certain, and told the whole neighborhood he was going to put the quiet widower down right there, that it was finally time everyone saw which of them was actually the strong one. 40 faces turned toward Nathan at once. The entire gathering pulled into a single held breath. Nathan didn't move. To all of them, he looked like a man swallowing his fear, and that was the exact image Charles had spent weeks arranging to put in front of them. One of Tyler's friends already had a phone raised, and Tyler made sure the camera found him turning into it, broadcasting the whole confrontation live to whoever was watching on the other end. He wanted an audience far larger than the cul-de-sac. He wanted the humiliation of the ghost of the block recorded and shared in permanent, and he narrated his own challenge to the little glowing lens as though the ending were already written, and already his. Nathan looked down at the gloves in the grass and didn't pick them up. He told Tyler plainly, without any bite in it, that he had no reason to fight him and no intention of doing so. He said it once, and when Tyler crowded closer, he said it a second time, keeping his voice level and his hands open and low, giving the camera and the crowd nothing at all but a man declining to be moved. Every word of it was true. He didn't want this, and far more than that, he understood with total, quiet clarity exactly what would happen to the young man in front of him if the not wanting ever changed. Tyler read the refusal the way the whole crowd read it, as fear. And it fed him past the point of any sense. He circled closer, throwing the insults harder now, calling Nathan a coward to his face and to the phone, mocking the man who hid behind his blinds and his silence, and the memory of his wife, daring him to be anything other than the frightened old man everyone standing there could plainly see. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, Nathan understood something that shifted the arithmetic under his feet. The silence had stopped working. Every time he swallowed it whole, Tyler only grew louder and surer and more dangerous, and a young man that convinced of his own invincibility was a young man already halfway to badly hurting someone who couldn't answer him back. Tyler threw the first strike, and it was a real one, nothing playful in it. He came in fast and heavy, a trained combination thrown to drop the older man in front of everyone he'd spent the afternoon performing for, and the crowd made a single sharp sound as the whole of it landed on nothing at all. Nathan simply wasn't where the punches were. He'd moved the small distances that make all the difference, the inches a man learns only by surviving people who genuinely meant to end him, and the strikes that should have finished it passed clean through empty air. What Nathan did next, he did with a restraint far harder than any counter would have been. He controlled the young man rather than hurting him, catching a wrist here, turning a shoulder there, letting Tyler's own momentum carry him stumbling past, never once closing his open hand into a fist. He redirected everything that came at him and returned none of it. To a crowd that didn't remotely understand what it was watching, it still looked like a man barely surviving, instead of a man deciding over and over, in the space of single seconds, not to break the person swinging at him. The failure to land anything at all drove Tyler past anger into something worse than anger. He abandoned whatever discipline his training had ever given him and started throwing strikes meant to do real damage. Elbows and driving knees aimed at the head, the kind of blows that end careers and sometimes end lives. Still Nathan only turned each one aside and stepped clear of it. The young man was fighting a ghost now in a way he hadn't intended, swinging harder at a target that wouldn't stay where he put it, and the more he missed, the more reckless and dangerous he became. From the edge of the circle, Charles watched with a hope rising in him he could barely keep off his own face. This was the thing he'd built, the overreaction he needed, and he could feel it coming. He began, low and steady, to push his son on, telling him the older man was almost finished, that one more would put him down, feeding the fire from a safe few feet away, waiting for the single excessive moment that would hand him the whole contract and the neighbor's ruin along with it. He didn't care what it cost his son to get there. He only needed the camera to catch the calm man doing something that could never be forgiven. It was Tyler who reached for the metal. Somewhere past the last edge of his control, he snatched a heavy tool from beside one of the grills, a solid length of it that turned the whole confrontation in an instant from a beating into something that could kill, and swung it at Nathan's head with everything he had left in him. In that single instant, the man who'd spent weeks letting the street treat him like weather became, for the first time in front of any of them, the thing he actually was underneath all of it. What happened after that took only a few seconds. Nathan moved inside the swing before the metal ever reached him, took the arm that held it, and unmade the entire attack with a precision that had nothing amateur in it. An economy of motion that stripped the weapon loose, folded the young man down to the grass, and held him there completely immobile, without a single blow struck in anger. It was finished before most of the crowd had understood that it had even changed, and in the stunned quiet that dropped over the cul-de-sac, every person there was suddenly staring at a man they no longer recognized at all. The silver-haired guest from across the street had come to the edge of the circle while the rest of them watched, and he was staring at Nathan now with an old recognition breaking slowly across his face. He said the name out loud before he thought better of it, spoke it right into the hush, and then said the thing that went with it, that this was a man who had once led a Navy SEAL team, a commander he'd known in another life entirely. The words moved through the gathering like a current through water, and the ghost of the block, the frightened old man they'd all been so sure of, dissolved in front of them, leaving something far more troubling standing where he'd been. Charles heard every word of it, and a slower man might have been finished on the spot. He was not a slower man. He saw in the same instant that his son was pinned in the grass and that the thing he'd spent weeks assembling had just gone off in a direction he'd never planned for, and he understood at once that the story of this afternoon was now his to seize or his to lose. He already had the phone in his hand. He called the police while the whole crowd was still frozen and staring, and the words he chose were careful, loud, and precisely wrong. A report of a trained government killer, a Navy man who had just assaulted his boy in front of 40 witnesses on a quiet suburban street. The victory in the grass had lasted no longer than a single heartbeat. Nathan released the young man and stepped back with his hands open and low again, already knowing from the tone of Charles's voice carrying across the cul-de-sac, and the phone still raised all around him, that he'd just walked straight into the exact trap that had been built for him. He'd refused the fight for as long as any man could have refused it, and in the one instant he'd finally been forced to answer, the answer had become the weapon they would use to bury him. The smoke was still rising off the grills, and the whole street was looking at him as though they'd never seen him before in their lives. The police arrived within a few minutes. 2 officers stepping into a cul-de-sac that had gone quiet and strange, the grills still smoking, 40 people still standing where the fight had left them. Charles met them first, already the aggrieved father, his son sitting stunned in the grass while he described a trained government killer who'd attacked a young man over nothing. Nathan gave his own account plainly and briefly, keeping his hands visible and his voice level. The silver-haired guest from across the street told the officers what he'd actually watched happen from the edge of the circle. The officers took it all down without deciding anything, the way officers do when a street full of people has just seen the same event and can't agree on what it was. They noted that a metal tool had been involved and that the older man had no mark on him, and they left it as a dispute to be sorted out later, telling both households to stay clear of each other. It should have ended there, an ugly afternoon that would fade the way ugly afternoons do. Charles had no intention of letting it fade, because the police report was never the weapon he cared about. The weapon was the phone. Within a day he'd cut the footage down to the shape he needed. He had weeks of saved clips and the livestream from the barbecue, hours of a young man harassing a quiet neighbor, and out of all of it he built a single short video that told the exact opposite of the truth. It opened on the last few seconds, on the terrible precision of Nathan taking the tool and folding Tyler down into the grass, and it kept none of what had come before, none of the gloves thrown down, none of the insults, none of the metal swung at a man's skull. It showed only a trained killer destroying a boy, and it ended there. The clip moved through town the way those things move, passed from phone to phone faster than anyone could answer it, and the story it carried was simple and cruel and easy to believe. People who had never met Nathan Cole watched 10 seconds of a Navy man taking apart someone half his age and decided they knew everything they needed to know. The word that had followed him around Willow Creek flipped in an afternoon from coward to something far more dangerous, and the same neighbors who had whispered that he was afraid now whispered that he was a threat who'd been living quietly among them the whole time. Charles didn't stop at the video. He was a man with the phone numbers of people who mattered, and he began working every one of them, telling the same careful story into every ear that would take it. He let it be known in the right offices that the federal evaluator assigned to review his company had assaulted his family in the street, and he framed it as exactly the kind of scandal no agency wanted attached to a contract worth tens of millions of dollars. He wanted Nathan removed from the file. He wanted the review handed to someone with no history and no grudge, and he pressed that demand through every channel he'd bought his way into over the years. Nathan learned the shape of the campaign the way he learned most things, quietly and completely, watching the video spread and hearing, through the professional channels he still moved in, that questions were being raised about his fitness to finish the assessment. He understood at once what had been done to him, and how well it had been done. Standing in his plain house with the blinds half drawn against a street that now feared him, he found himself holding something that most men in his position would never have been able to set down. He held real power, and the men who had ruined him had handed him every reason to use it. The file was still his. Vance Transport still sat open on his desk, its future still due to cross his hands. He knew that company the way an evaluator comes to know a thing he's studied for months. Knew where it was weak, knew what a careful, damning report would do to it, and knew that no one on earth would question a single word of that report after what the world had watched Tyler do to him on that livestream. He could bury Charles Vance legitimately, inside the rules, with the man's own contract as the grave, and no one would ever be able to prove it was anything but honest work. For a while he let himself feel the weight of that, because he was not a saint and had never claimed to be. The temptation to answer a man like Charles in the one language a man like Charles understood was real, and it was strong. He turned it over the way he turned over everything, coldly and slowly, and he saw clearly that he'd earned the right to it, that no one would blame him, that it would even look like justice. And then he saw the thing underneath the temptation. That the moment he used the file as a weapon, he would become exactly what the edited video already claimed he was, a man who reached for the tool at hand simply because he could. That was the whole of it, laid out as plainly as any decision he'd ever made. He could use his authority to destroy the family that had tried to destroy him, or he could keep his hands open the way he'd kept them open in the grass, and let the law and an independent process sort out what was true. The first path would have satisfied everything in him that had been insulted and cornered and lied about. The second would leave him defenseless a while longer against the story that was winning. He chose the second, because the first was not a choice a man like him got to make and stay a man like him. He did the cleanest thing available to him, and the hardest. He went to the agency himself before anyone forced his hand, and asked to be removed from the Vance evaluation on the grounds of a conflict of interest, filing a report in which he had nothing and spared himself nothing, laying out the harassment, the confrontation, and the relationship between the two households. He set the file down entirely, gave up the one weapon that could have ended Charles inside the rules, and handed the whole matter to people who had no stake in it. It looked from the outside like a man retreating. It was the single most disciplined thing he did in the entire affair. The withdrawal did what the shouting never could have. The moment a neutral party took over, the question stopped being about Nathan and started being about the footage. And footage, unlike a man's reputation, could be checked. The neighbors who had filmed that afternoon still had their full recordings. The unedited minutes that showed the gloves thrown at Nathan's feet, the insults about his dead wife, the young man swinging a heavy tool at his head. Those complete videos began to surface, one after another, set beside the short, cruel clip Charles had built, and the contrast between them told a story no amount of pressure could talk over. The same complaint Charles had pushed into the right offices was what opened the door on him. Once his accusation put the matter in front of a neutral body, that body did what he'd never expected it to do. It looked at everything, not just the 10 seconds he'd chosen, and the whole of his design came apart in their hands. They compared the edited video against the originals and saw exactly what had been cut and why. They traced the calls he'd made and found a pattern that wasn't a father's outrage, but a campaign. And at the center of it, they found the thing that finished him. Evidence that Charles Vance had deliberately manufactured a false account and leaned on a federal official to force a government evaluator off a contract he stood to win. That was no longer a neighborhood dispute. That was a crime. The consequences came down the way such things come down, slowly, and then all at once. Vance Transport was disqualified from the defense contract entirely, the tens of millions of dollars gone the moment the manipulation surfaced, because no agency could hand sensitive freight to a man who tried to corrupt his own review. Charles was forced out of the business he'd built, made to resign under the weight of what the investigation had turned up, the generous neighbor undone by the one afternoon he'd been most certain would make him. Everything he'd reached for with that campaign turned to ash in his hands, and he'd lit the match himself. Tyler lost the thing he'd built his whole young life around. The complete footage, once it was everywhere, didn't show the fearsome fighter he'd wanted the world to see. It showed a young man throwing everything he had at an opponent who wouldn't hit him back, missing over, and finally reaching for a weapon when his own skill failed him. It ended a competitive career that had run on reputation more than it had ever run on results. No promoter wanted the man from that video. The thing he'd done to prove he was strong was the exact thing that proved he wasn't, and it followed him out of the sport for good. The two houses on Willow Creek stayed quiet for a long while after that, the Vance family packing to leave a street that now knew precisely what they were. It was near the end of it, with a moving truck in the driveway and summer coming on, that Tyler crossed the grass to Nathan's door on his own, without his father, without an audience, without a phone in his hand. He was not the same young man who had thrown the gloves down. Something had been taken out of him by the last weeks, and something else, harder to name, seemed to have been let in. He said what he'd come to say, which was that he was sorry, and he said it plainly, without the swagger that had carried every word out of him before. He told Nathan he'd understood something he'd never understood in his life until he watched himself on that video, a man swinging a piece of metal at someone who kept choosing not to break him. He'd spent all his years believing that strength was the ability to put another man on the ground, and he'd learned the hardest way there was that the strongest thing he'd ever seen was a man who could have destroyed him in a single second and had refused to, over and over, in front of everyone. Nathan listened to all of it in the doorway and didn't make the young man grovel, because there was no use left in it, and never had been. He told Tyler, in about as many words as he ever used, that being able to hurt someone had never once been the point, that anyone could learn to break a body, and the only thing that had ever been worth anything was knowing when not to. He said it the way he said everything, level and quiet, a man stating a fact he'd paid for. Tyler took it, nodded, and went back across the grass to the truck. The family left Willow Creek, and the street closed over the whole affair the way a street does. Nathan went back to the life he'd kept before any of it began. He took his coffee on the porch before the sun was fully up, mowed his own grass, and returned to the careful, invisible work of reading the files that decided which men could be trusted with what mattered, bringing to it the same steadiness he always had. The neighbors who had feared him and the neighbors who had pitted him settled, in time, into simply leaving him be, and he preferred it that way, the same as he always had. He replanted the flowers along his walk one more time, and this time nothing came to tear them out. He never told anyone the rest of it, the missions with his name buried in them, the nights he'd walked back from, and he never once mentioned that he'd held the power to bury Charles Vance inside the rules, and had chosen to set it down instead. That part stayed his, as the important things always had. He hadn't fought Tyler Vance to prove he was the stronger man. He hadn't spared the Vance family to prove he was the better one. He had simply understood, long before any of them, that real strength was never measured by the man a man could put on the ground. It was measured by the courage to hold himself still, to stand for what was right, and to refuse, whatever the cost, to use what he was capable of against those who couldn't answer it.